Okay, welcome to our incident response presentation for our enterprise security class at Red Rocks Community College. The class is taught by Rafael Ramirez. My name is Don Smith, and I'm joined by Kylan Coffey and Wesley Reeves. Welcome, gentlemen. Let's get started. See, Western Area Power Administration consists of 6 regions, 15 states, 667 nonprofit partners serving multiple individual companies and 40 million customers. The biggest business and IT problem we determined would be making sure that the 667 partners actually comply with all federal regulations, company policies, and the service level agreements. Our business assets summary included hydroelectric power systems valued around $6 billion, transmission infrastructure program estimated at a value of 79.2 million, reclamation fund equaling 5 billion, and total assets after debts were removed to about 8 billion in total assets. The net profit for WAPA during the fiscal year of 2019 equaled $848 million. Let's see, the personnel assets. The workforce is about 1,458 federal employees spread across 6 regions, 15 states, and the 660 not-for-profit partners. These partners sell to private companies. These partners also sell to Native American tribes, and then another 40 million individual customers. It's a vast company. It's large, so if something goes wrong, a lot of people are out of power.
So for WAPA's technical assets, this is more of a general slash conservative estimate of the hardware and software they have to keep their infrastructure up. I'm sure there's much more than this. This is, I would say, a good estimate to what they have. So starting with hardware and their network switches, they probably have about 7,500, maybe anywhere from 8 to 8,000 um, networking switches. Um, the software that those networking switches use to be managed by would be either Cisco or Ubiquiti, depending on what vendor they got the hardware from. They definitely would have to have at least 3,000 SCADA control systems. Basically, this will control all the more industry power meters, power meters, more of the electrical side of electrical side of the grid. This is going to manage the log data control. It'll um, basically, most likely the log data will be exported to Splunk. That would manage and parse this data. They're gonna have to have some pretty hefty storage, so they're gonna have to have at least 300 storage arrays. Most likely they'll use TrueNAS or some sort of more open source software. Um, they're going to at least have to have 200 network firewalls. Most likely the software that's going to be running on those network firewalls are going to be either from the vendor Palo Alto or Fortinet for firewall and routing. Um, they're going to have at least probably like 200 to 250 compute servers. This is where they're going to run a lot of the virtualization software for services such as like Windows Server and Ubuntu, which Splunk will run on. Um, and speaking of Splunk, they're going to use 300 power monitors, which Splunk Enterprise will use for log data management. Um, for their workstation slash laptops, they're going to have a astronomical amount. They're probably going to have about 30,000 worth, just so they can support, having maybe an employee wants 1 to 2 workstations, and then they'll have to have replacements in there. All of those laptops and workstations will have to have Windows 10 Pro with BitLocker enabled on it. And they'll also have to pay for 50 Windows Server licenses that will run on the compute servers, the 200 compute servers. This will make sure that there's plenty of resources for Active Directory to authenticate these employees, and also potentially manage internal DNS zones. Um, and for any external services, they're going to probably be using a cloud provider. Um, Maybe not just one. They'll probably use a combination of like AWS, Google Cloud, and Azure, and they'll probably use like Kubernetes or some cluster management software.
So we wanted to talk a lot about business email compromise and supply chain attacks, sometimes otherwise known as vendor email compromise. These are very present day tactics being used by attackers. What are we talking about when we're looking at business email compromise? Essentially, what would happen is an attacker sends fake invoices to a company looking as though they are coming from a vendor or a business partner of that company. Typically, they might be posing as C-level personnel, such as the CEO, CFO, or CISO, impersonating legal or government entities. And typically, they're targeting personal interactions within a company's departments, like human resources, receptionists, or accounting. And usually what they're doing is they're kind of exploiting and leveraging inherent trust that exists between some of those departments and potentially any entities or other organizations or partners that they're typically in regular contact with. It's important to understand that BEC and VEC are very much synonymous with one another. So when we're talking about remediation, we have to kind of look at this as both containment and eradication. So we can take some steps to first contain the problem and eventually eradicate it. We can, for example, perform next login password reset for users. We can contact the affected users and or customers immediately. We can enable multi-factor authentication. We can identify any external IP that was used to access the compromised email account. Finally, when we're on to eradication, we can identify the exact email message that was used to breach or attempt to steal sensitive information. We can identify activities performed by any affected email addresses. We can refer to containment to remediate the affected email accounts. And finally, we can implement logging to try to get a wider picture of everything that took place and will continue to take place.
Yeah, this is a list of represents the CIO representatives who are responsible for writing the policies, service level agreements, and incident response plans for the respective regions. They're also responsible for ensuring that the 667 not-for-profit partners comply with the federal regulations, company policies, and incident response. Next slide, please. Incident response plan flow chart starts with the person who discovers the incident. They will call the WAPA 24/7 help desk. There's three possible sources of discovery. It could be an end user, it could be a system alert, which would also include an IT technician, or an outside source like the police department, or any other company may call us and let us know that there's been an issue. Each source would contact the WAPA 24/7 help desk if the person discovering the incident is a member of the IT department or affected department. They will create their own ticket. Once a ticket is created, the help desk will refer to the IT emergency contact list and escalate the ticket to the members of the incident response team. Those members will discuss the situation and determine if the situation is an incident or not. If it is declared an incident, they will determine a response strategy. Once they agree to the strategy, the IR team members will conduct the investigation using forensic techniques, including reviewing system logs, looking for gaps in logs, reviewing intrusion detection logs, and interviewing witnesses and the incident victim to determine how the incident was caused. Only authorized personnel should be performing the interviews or examining evidence. The IR team will take extra care in preserving all evidence and documentation. Now, once the incident is mitigated and affected systems are restored to working order, the investigation will be closed and a review of the response and policies will begin. asking questions like, have changes been made to prevent a new and similar incident? Should any security policies be updated? And what lessons have we been learned during this experience? So once that's done, that concludes our incident response plan presentation.
Here we have our deliverables. So in our paper, we had inventory tables, basically showing what inventory WAPA has. I'm sure there's more than what we could gather. We also made a asset and risk assessment chart, or table, and we talked about that. We also had that amazing incident response flow chart that Don created. And so those were some of the deliverables in our paper. Outcomes. Our paper is a pretty good starting point, but for a company of the size of WAPA, would probably need some more information from the company to accurately assess their assets and the risks they have. But we are able to get a good starting point and a good general overview for what a company of this size has to deal with and overcome.
Let's see, what have I learned? I've learned that this was a massive undertaking, and not just because it's a massive company, but when you take into account the network topology and the regions, the redundancy, the software, hardware, assessments, policy procedures, documentation, and communication, it's just a massive, complicated, and really a living entity. But it is a good representation of what the energy sector is like. There's really no energy companies are very small. This really takes a lot of people, and that's what I took out of it.
Yeah, and this company is absolutely huge. We probably could have done a smaller company, but overall, this was a good learning experience because it shows us that in order to do one change, it's not just as easy as be like, oh, just implement two-factor authentication. They have to roll that out to hundreds of thousands of employees, and that takes a lot of time and planning compared to a smaller company or a medium-sized business. Um, and our paper that we wrote is probably pretty good for a general start, but it would help if we were more of a we had more insider information, and that's what I've learned from this.
I agree.
Yeah, it's a big company, and energy sector is critical. Um, when we're talking about national security and the well-being of the state, then energy sector is one of the first things that comes to mind. So it was interesting to choose this, but yeah, it was obviously a huge undertaking. But nevertheless, it gives us some perspective. So that concludes our incident response plan presentation. In this presentation, we introduced you to Western Area Power Administration, and we assessed their assets and risks. We then reviewed mitigation processes and finally walked through the incident response plan. We hope you enjoyed our presentation, and thank you very much.